Following the failure of the Dieppe raid in August of 1942, concerns that the A-22 Churchill infantry tank was too slow and unreliable started to build up. It was suggested that production of the A-22 Churchill would halt in 1943 in order to manufacture more of the A-27 Cromwell design, which was performing well in ongoing trials. The idea became more popular following the interests in a universal tank chassis, from which infantry and cruiser tanks would be derived from. Following this interest, designs to replace the Churchill based on the A-27 Cromwell tank were considered. Rolls-Royce proposed an up-armored A-27 Cromwell. Two designs were thought of, being A-31 and A-32, which were an up-armored Cromwell and a Cromwell with redesigned suspension and armor equivalent to the Churchill. English Electric, who was contracted to produce the A-27 Cromwell, proposed using the A-27 hull and turret with extra armor and the track and suspension of the US M6 heavy tank, which was developed for both American and British use. This scheme received the General Staff number A-33. English Electric built two prototypes on the A-27 Cromwell hulls, the first being A-33-1, which featured the T1 track and suspension of the M6, however it was armed with the QF 6-pounder cannon. The second prototype, known as A-33-2 or A-33B, featured widened Cromwell track and suspension, with the side skirts being redesigned. The notable changes being that A-33-2 was more armored compared to A-33-1 and was armed with the OQF 75mm cannon, which was a license-produced copy of the US 75mm M3. However, during ongoing construction and testing of both A-33 prototypes, the Churchill was improved and it performed well enough to not warrant it being replaced. This led the A-33-1 and A-33-2 to be put in storage/on display. While the idea floated around to upgun the A-33 with the 77mm gun, this was turned down as the Cromwell III received the 75mm cannon of the A-33, as well as the Comet being armed with the 77mm gun. After the war, A-33-1 was used as a decoration and was later moved to be used as hard target for gunnery practice, and since then has been completely lost, most likely being scrapped. However, A-33-2 survived by becoming a museum piece for the Bovington Tank Museum, where it was displayed outside and inside. However, much like its American cousin, the T-14, the A-33-2 has been taken off public display and is now stored in the Vehicle Conservation Center in the museum's grounds. The nickname Excelsior, which the A-33 is most known for, comes from the fact that it was superiorly armored and more mobile than other variants of its class. However, the official name of the A-33 is the Commodore, as that is what English Electric calls the A-33 in some documentation. In War Thunder, the A-33 Excelsior is the A-33-2 model and sits at a BR of 4.0. And it is an event vehicle which was obtainable in the 2017 War Thunder Chronicles event. Contrary to any other British World War II tank, the Excelsior combines good armor and mobility. The cannon of the Excelsior is identical to that of the 75mm armed M4 Sherman, featuring the M61 AP round. However, due to being British, it uses the solid shot version of the round. The current state of solid shot in game is somewhat bad, as sometimes it tends to one-shot, other times it does essentially no damage. However, due to the speed and mobility of the Excelsior, including the armor, it's mostly usable. However, Soviet tanks like the T-34, and mainly the KV-1 and KV-2, can be very annoying to fight, especially in large numbers, such as in 1v3s, which often happen. The armor of the Excelsior is very good, however, it is notably still vulnerable to the German 75mm cannon, the US 76mm cannon, and the Soviet 85mm cannon. Angling the Excelsior is usually the best way to utilize its armor. The main weakness of the Excelsior is the gun breach area, as unlike the Cromwell, it features a 63mm plate, rather than the 88mm plate found on the Cromwell. This leaves the Excelsior vulnerable to weaker guns such as the Soviet ZIS-5 and L-11, as well as the US 75mm M3. From the side, the Excelsior, if unangled, is vulnerable to almost every gun it can face. Much like the German Tiger tank, to properly use the armor of the Excelsior, it is extremely important to angle. However, one notable upside is due to the Excelsior being so rare, enemies will take more time to identify what you are, and this often makes them aim longer or panic fire. The major weak spots of the Excelsior that should be covered or concealed include mainly the hull machine gun port and the gun breech area, which can be easily identified by the cutout in the turret face and the machine gun. The armament of the Excelsior is nothing special for the battle rating, being comparable to that of other British and American medium tanks. The main armament is the OQF V5 75mm cannon, capable of firing 3 shell types, these being solid shot AP, high explosive, and smoke. The ready rack and ammo storage of the Excelsior is very good, as all of the ammo is low in the hull under the turret, and the ready rack is rather big, being 24 rounds. The main anti-tank round of the Excelsior is the M61 solid shot round. It is identical to the M61 shot found on American tanks, however, it features no explosive filler. Due to the somewhat random nature of solid shot and low damage, it is important to aim for ammo racks and imported crew, such as gunners and drivers of enemy tanks. As well, it features the M72 solid shot round, but the M72 is outclassed in every single aspect by M61, and there is no point in using it. It is essentially one of the worst AP rounds in the entire game. The main round for open-top targets is the M48 high explosive shell. It is mainly used in overpressuring open-top tank destroyers such as the M10 Wolverine, the Dicker Max, Martyr 3, and others. As due to the 666 grams of explosive filler, it will always one-shot open-top targets even if they are hit in areas such as the tracks. The M89 smoke round is a utility that can be fired to blind enemies or to cover the Excelsior or allied tanks. However, the Excelsior features a smoke grenade launcher with 30 charges, so the M89 smoke shell is usually used at range to blind enemies which are very dangerous to the Excelsior, but for one way or another cannot be killed outright. The Excelsior has the interesting feature of being the only tank in game to have both the coaxial machine gun in the turret and the bow machine gun both be fully functional. This can be useful to destroy very open-top targets such as the American M19 or M24 anti-aircraft vehicles, along with milk trucks, usually by shooting solid shot into the hull and using the MG to take out the rest of the exposed crew. However, due to the fact that the Excelsior is British, the machine guns have an extremely low rate of fire, and due to the caliber, they are quite weak. Like most British tanks at the BR, such as the Churchill family and Cromwell's, the Excelsior features excellent gun depression in its forward arc, having 12 degrees of gun depression. However, this only applies to the forward arc. Due to the tanks being extremely wide, the depression over the sides and rear can be limited. The mobility of the Excelsior is extremely good, as due to the tank being 40 tons, it can very easily hit speeds of 40 kilometers an hour off-road. However, like every other British Second World War tank, the reverse gear is extremely bad, but this can be mitigated by using the smoke launcher and turning around instead of reversing. In conclusion, the Excelsior, like most event tanks of its time, is extremely good, having both great mobility and armor and solid firepower. It is extremely fun to play, however, solid shot can be somewhat tedious to use. My favorite thing about the Excelsior is the fact that most new players do not know what the Excelsior is, and that it even exists. This usually leads to them messing up their shots and staring at you, and it's quite funny.
I'm in a 1v1 with the Grunt. Can you fuck off, Grunt? Oh, Andy! No!
There's a thrusting
no!
gun.